hotels are almost empty. In many cases, nearly half their staff have been let go. Many restaurants have closed, and some face a backlash if they choose to stay open.
We're supposed to do some work for the Junos and East Coast Music Awards. The companies have called us and called off their orders or asked us to put them on hold.
Closing a salon, closing a small business, it's hard. Because like as a small salon, this is my life, so I work. If I don't work, I was not paid.
Across the country, workers are losing their jobs. Their hours are getting cut, their contracts are getting canceled, and business owners are having to make some really tough decisions. Should they close their doors to protect the health of their employees, or lay people off because there's no customers coming in, or remain optimistic and keep the business running somehow? Just a week ago, this was all unthinkable, and no one saw it coming. But now, a lot of people are looking to the government for help. Yesterday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced an $82 billion aid package to provide some immediate financial relief to people who are already feeling the effects of this pandemic. And today we're going to spend some time going through how the government is planning to do that and whether this proposal is enough. I'm talking to Rosalie Wanch. She's a policy analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute. From Global News, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. Hey, Rosalie, thanks so much for doing this.
I'm happy to be here. It's clearly a time of uncertainty and there's a lot going on, so I'm happy to be here to maybe clear up some confusion for the people out there.
We really appreciate it. So obviously a lot of people are really worried about the economic impact of this pandemic. We're already seeing a lot of job losses, a lot of people's hours are being cut down. And I guess I wanted to start by asking you, do we have a sense yet of who will be or is already being hit hardest by this pandemic?
It is still early days, so it's too early to say who will be the worst hit, but just some recent results from an Angus Reid poll showed that about 10% of people had been either laid off or lost hours, and that it was highest for the group of people that were 18 to 24 years old, and it basically, the proportion lowered as people age. So at least from the perceptions out there, it looks like younger people are the most likely to be hard hit in terms of job losses.
And do we have a sense of what kinds of jobs are being affected and what sectors these people are working in?
The hardest hit sectors are the ones that require workers to physically be at work to actually maintain normal operations, and those that are more precariously employed to begin with. So, temporary part-time contract workers, as well as those that work in, say, recreation, amusement, travel, basically any job where people need to congregate in large numbers are really the jobs that are most affected.
At least 10,000 jobs are expected to be lost. These are hotel workers, servers and bartenders, even people working at big event centers.
Our industry is evaporating before our very eyes, and it's not like anything any of us have ever seen.
So basically anyone who can't work from home, like you or I can.
I would say anyone that can't work from home, as well as people that maybe work freelance or generally work out of their home, but work for sectors or provide services to sectors that are currently being hard hit. So just as an example, potentially photographers, makeup artists, people like that normally might be independent freelance workers, but simply the events that they would normally cover are being canceled.
A lot of events, a lot of weddings are postponing or canceling. We just laid off our staff, which is brutally painful.
Okay, so Trudeau announced this $82 billion aid package yesterday that includes $27 billion in direct supports and another $55 billion to help businesses through tax deferrals. And as we know, Parliament has been suspended because they're practicing social distancing, but they could be recalled as early as next week to pass this legislation and bring these measures in. And I want to go through them one by one. So I want to start with the tax deferrals. What does this do exactly?
Basically, it doesn't mean that the government isn't going to collect those taxes at some point. It simply means that they're not collecting them at the moment, which means that that money can be kept in business owners' pockets so that they can maintain normal operations and, lighten the load and reduce some of their costs related to actually filing those taxes and giving over that money.
Right. So tax payments have been delayed until August 31st.
The CRA has now delayed the tax deadline. It's now June 1st, so that's an extra 2 months for you to get all your paperwork together. As well, if you have money owed, that's not going to be due until later in the summer.
But we can still file our tax returns as soon as we want.
Basically, if someone is likely to actually receive benefits or an income tax return, they can still file their tax return and get that money now, as well as, potentially access some of the enhanced benefits that I'm sure we'll get into in a minute. But for those that might owe money, they can keep that money for the time being during the current crisis. And then once we have sort of resumed normal economic operations, then the government will start collecting on those bills.
So for workers, the two most relevant parts, it seemed to me, of this proposed plan are enhanced eligibility for EI and then 2 new emergency benefits. So let's talk about those. So with EI, you can get sickness benefits and usually you have to wait a week. So this is EI for when you're forced to stay home from work because you're sick. But under this new plan, if you're not able to work because you've been told to quarantine or self-isolate, you're not going to have to wait the usual 1 week, and you wouldn't be required to have a doctor's note or a medical certificate.
It's an adjustment to deal with the immediacy of the situation. Normally, the reason that there's a week waiting period is simply just that's a reasonable waiting period for most situations. In this situation, we want people to be immediately self-isolating if they're sick, and so basically having an administrative waiting period is just a needless barrier in the current circumstances. And that's really the only major change there.
Right. Okay. But there are people who don't qualify for this EI sickness benefit. And for them, the government is introducing an emergency care benefit.
Let's start with people who don't qualify for employment insurance and don't have access to paid sick leave. Our government will introduce the emergency
care benefit is for anyone that needs to self-isolate for 2 weeks, is sick themselves, or is providing care to a family member, and they don't have access to EI. This program is aimed at addressing that gap for those workers, up to $450 per week.
To workers who have to stay home. People will receive this benefit for 14 weeks for an amount comparable to what would be paid through EI.
The conditions around that are still slightly unclear, but it's like the announcement suggested that program is likely to go into operation in early April, so we should be getting those details soon.
Okay, and there are a lot of people who are going to lose their jobs or see their hours go down, like we talked about, because of this pandemic, and for them, the government wants to introduce an emergency support benefit.
If you lose your job and you do not qualify for EI, we will be introducing a COVID-19 emergency support benefit to help you. This will apply also to people who are self-employed and have to close shop because of the virus.
What is that supposed to do, and how is it different from the emergency care benefit, which we just talked about?
Well, it's extremely similar, but I would say just less directed at health and sickness specifically. And it's more similar to EI in that its goal is to act as a bridge and income support in this time where those that don't qualify for EI have, either lost contracts or lost a certain amount of hours, but are still employed, but have faced serious reductions.
Colleen Pusher owns a cleaning company. Wanda Johnson-Charette's her employee. Neither are cleaning a thing. Nobody wants visitors.
So we probably won't be going into any houses for the next few weeks at least.
1/3 of clients have canceled contracts, and Pusher worries at some point that could mean layoffs.
However, who exactly will be qualified and what is meant by unemployment is at the moment slightly unclear. And what I mean by that is take, for example, a freelance worker that is able and willing to work, but due to the current economic circumstances have found themselves effectively unemployed because their contracts have been canceled or the events that they were going to do have been canceled. So it's not clear exactly whether this package will cover those workers as well. But again, the details are rolling out.
Do we know how much money the government is expected to give these people? Would it be on par with EI, do you think?
It's likely that it's either similar to EI, as in the sort of 55% income replacement on average, or whether it will be capped similarly to the emergency care benefit at $450 per week. Those details, I think, are still to be announced. But at least notionally, the support is similar to EI.
I think it's going to help a lot, right? I think it's going to help with our bare minimums to be able to just get by.
That emergency funding that they're hoping, I'm hoping that they can roll that out quicker and sooner. It's not that complicated for people to get access to that money.
And the government is also planning to place a 6-month moratorium on repaying student loans, which I imagine will help a lot of people paying off student debt. So you could get 55% of your income through EI potentially, or the support benefit, and then you don't have to make your student loan payments, right? What kind of impact do you think that's going to have?
I think that really, especially since earlier we were talking about that younger workers are being laid off or losing hours in a higher proportion than older workers. That's also the cohort of society that is most likely to have pretty significant student debt and student debt repayment. So by deferring those payments and also not adding interest to that debt in the next few months, it basically keeps a few $100 more in those people's pockets. It should effectively provide some income support simply because it's lowering costs for anyone that would normally have to make student loan payments.
We'll be right back. I want to talk about small businesses a bit. The government is proposing giving small businesses that are struggling with the impact of COVID-19 a 10% wage subsidy. So up to $1,375 per employee and $25,000 per employer for a period of up to 3 months. And before we talk about that, can you give me an example of the challenges that a small business might be dealing with right now?
So a small business, they may be having difficulty sourcing supplies because borders are shutting down due to sort of ongoing supply shortages of various things. The prices for what they normally need may have gone up. So they're basically in a situation where they're likely to have fewer customers or more costs in reaching their customers, as well as paying higher costs to run their business generally. And so in that situation, they're in a cash crunch.
Another home-based family business struggles with COVID.
Because April is usually a really big month for me. I'm expecting at least 50%, if not less, of work coming in.
People just don't want a visit from the plumber.
And so they either have to choose to dial back business or adjust their business practices in certain ways, or essentially trim the fat and lay off workers, weather the bad times, with the hope that you can rehire those workers once the economy recovers.
Kelly Cairns would normally be serving a packed restaurant, but instead, she's helping her staff apply for EI.
Once we know everyone has an income coming in and it's going to be okay to close, that's when we'll make the decisions.
And the wage subsidy for small businesses aimed at keeping your staff employed, a more attractive option.
Right. So the wage subsidy is meant to prevent layoffs, but 10% seems really low. Would that even have a significant impact?
Well, I would say that number is, that's a piece of the business support package, and it's really the piece of the business support package that's really focused on labor directly. But there's also other things that were included in the package, such as the corporate tax deferment, as well as opening up credit support for businesses and access to emergency loans. One of the things that was announced was basically an emergency credit, so businesses can access up to $100,000 in an emergency loan, which for many small businesses is quite a substantial amount of money, and basically the option of a loan from the government, separate from the federal government. The provinces are now introducing their own stimulus packages for business and labor support. So there's sort of the federal package, and we're now sort of backstopping it with provincial stimulus packages and relief mechanisms that are in development and being announced. So there are other avenues for businesses to go through to basically alleviate the cash flow crunch. And if they have enough revenues to maintain more or less normal operations, then that in itself has the knock-on benefit of making it less likely that people are going to lose their jobs. And so the way that I look at this 10% wage subsidy is it's more of a nudge policy to make keeping your employees slightly more attractive when you're considering all of the options of what you might do. So I can't say whether 10% is enough, too much, too little, but I can say that it is a small piece of a larger package to support Canadian businesses, and that this is phase one. So basically, if the government is hearing from businesses that that simply isn't enough, then it seems that the federal government is quite open to adjusting the package, increasing stimulus or support for both individual households and families as well as businesses.
Yeah, so I've seen comparisons being made to like Denmark, where the government is giving small businesses a 75% wage subsidy and a maximum payout per employee would be 10 times higher than Canada's. So does it make sense to draw those sorts of comparisons right now?
I think it's good to draw comparisons. However, drawing comparisons on sort of individual policies isn't necessarily going to get comprehensive answers. We would have to look at Denmark's entire stimulus package and all of the relative policy supports, and then look at Canada's entire package to properly compare whether the level of support to business is comparable, but simply appearing in different forms.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So the other big thing that happened yesterday is that the big banks announced that they're going to offer support, including mortgage payment deferrals for up to 6 months for people struggling with the impact of COVID-19.
The country's 6 big banks are going to let customers defer mortgage payments for up to 6 months. The president of the Canadian Bankers Association said in a tweet that the measures are effective immediately.
What kind of impact do you think that is going to have?
Well, that's something that is really going to be handled on a case-by-case basis, but is likely going to make quite a few people a little bit less worried. In the event that you do lose your job, you're not going to lose your house. For people that are in a bad situation, they can, they'll be able to work with their bank and manage the situation without, facing massive losses or having to file for bankruptcy or default on their loans. So that's really important for recovery, and it also provides the immediate support of mortgage payments are a pretty significant portion of people's budgets. And so if people can keep that money in their pocket to get them through this emergency, then, that will help us recover faster and resume normal operations more quickly.
But just to be clear, there's no blanket guarantee. They're doing this on a case-by-case basis. And at this point, it's unclear if the deferrals would be interest-free.
Exactly. This is something that basically the big 6 banks have agreed to. But unlike the Canada student loans, there wasn't any promise of interest not accruing while you're not paying your debt. Basically, the information that people in the public need about this is if you are in that kind of a situation where you are going to have difficulty paying your bills, call your bank, because your bank won't start this process for you on your behalf, but they are willing to work with you. So what people need to know is simply if you are in a crisis, call them and see what you can get, and that's when you'll get the details of how it applies to you specifically.
So I haven't seen anything about renters in the federal government's plan. Could this also help renters at all?
There is the potential for an indirect benefit for renters, but it doesn't protect them directly, and it is still up to individual landlords. But if you are a landlord and you can defer your mortgage payments, then that means that there's less financial stress on landlords if they allow their tenants to defer rent. So in that sense, I think that there is an indirect benefit where landlords will have an incentive to be more lenient.
And I'll just note that some provinces have decided or are considering putting a stop to evictions as a way of dealing with this. So overall, if you could give this aid package a grade, what would it be?
I would say a solid A-, because it's got a lot of the things that we would like to see. There are supports for business, there are supports for households with a focus on labor and addressing gaps. It's all aimed towards moderating the short-term hardships so that we can resume normal economic activity. The only reason I give it a minus is simply that there are some details still missing in what we know about this package and potential gaps that may emerge as we implement. But overall, this is basically the government adding stimulus and support to the economy during a crisis, which is basically just good economics and what governments should be doing at this time of crisis.
So Trudeau said that the government has fiscal room to do this because of prudent decision-making over the last 5 years. But if this continues for a long time, and people are saying that we're going to have to live with these social distancing measures, it kind of varies, but some people are saying 6 months to a year. How much breathing room do we have here? And is the government going to be able to keep supporting people in this way longer term?
Well, really, the longer this crisis goes on, then the less room we will have fiscally to continue increasing the stimulus, simply because the government won't actually be collecting a lot of the money it normally gets. And really, previous to this crisis, the federal government had been running pretty significant deficits. From a debt to GDP ratio consideration, they were fine. But good economics says that when times are good, the government shouldn't be adding stimulus to the economy. It should really be saving for a rainy day. And so now we've hit that rainy day. And so while we are in a good position, and for at least the next 6 months, the plan is it's going according to plan, and there is room for the government to add stimulus. So we're not in a bad position, but the position that we're in could be better, with the deficit likely to grow and GDP likely to be lower. It's not going to be a good year for the fiscal sustainability picture, but in the short term, there is still quite a lot of room to maneuver.
Okay, and on that note, thank you so much, Rosalie. We really appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, that's the show. Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, yesterday's episode was all about the do's and don'ts of social distancing and how to do it properly as the number of coronavirus cases continues to rise across the country every day. So you can check that out. That's all for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.